Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara.
Vanessa, we got an amazing email from a parent who heard us speak recently. We were actually visiting the school that her child goes to. And it was amazing. It was so amazing that actually we had quite a back and forth with this question and conversation because she's a physician and knows a fair amount about the topic that she had a question about, sex and where babies come from. She knows a fair amount because she's an obstetrician. She works in this field. And the question that she had related to communicating with her child about her child's origin story. So here's what it was. She said, I used an egg donor. And I have been trying to figure out what the right time is to talk to my child about what an egg donor is, what that means genetically, how our family was made. And her child is young. I apologize because I can't remember exactly how young, but young enough that, kindergarten, first, something, second grade ish young. So sort of pre that she feels like she's missed the mark. She's trying to get in front of this. There have been no questions about this. There have been no questions about sex. And yet she knows this is a conversation she wants to get in front of. So she started to do what I would call a literature review, except a literature review usually means like all of the data, science, NIH studies, blah, blah, blah. Her literature review was books that are written for young kids about where babies come from. And the reason she reached out is because she has hit a wall that she cannot find content that is written specifically to describe this journey. And I want to frame in a little bit more detailed fashion what her specific question was. She said, look, there are lots of books that talk about all the different ways families are made, right? And there are books that talk about different ways the babies are conceived, but there isn't a body of literature that she could find that talks about when you have and now I'm using air quotes, traditional, just meaning this sort of old school notion of what a family looks like, man married to woman, they get married and then they have a baby, right? You and I have talked on this podcast for years about the upending of that sort of framing. But for the purposes of her question, she said, there's just nothing out there that talks about when you have that family structure and then you have fertility issues and then you use an egg donor or a sperm donor. How do you explain to a child where they came from in that scenario? Because it seems like there are a lot of wonderful explainers for a lot of other scenarios that land in a version of in vitro fertilization, but not her setup. And it was great question.
Yeah. And I mean, the question is it's not about what book do I read. It's really about how do I have conversations with my kid about our family. And that may be our family in any number of ways. And we can get into some of the ways in which, different families are made or different families function or whatever the case may be. It's really a conversation about how do I address it when our narrative doesn't fit the sort of traditional societal narrative, even though, Cara, in this case, we know that so many children are made not just with the traditional penis and vagina ejaculation, fertilization, pregnancy, but in many, many other ways involving science. So it's a larger conversation about how do you, as you like to say, toe into the conversation. And then as kids grow, how do you have the conversation in increasingly sophisticated ways? And this is a question about comprehension, right? Developmental stage and a kid's ability to comprehend what you're explaining. It's a conversation about privacy, about what experiences people have had and why getting pregnant might have been difficult for them. It's a conversation about making choices in life, choices that may be more complex or different than other people's choices. So it's a bigger topic, and it's a great question because it allows us to explore so many different things that we will often say to audiences when we say to them, okay, so how do you talk about sex? You say to them, well, one way people have sex. Or how do
That's
you
right.
talk about families? And we talk about, well, one way people might make a family, right? It's opening up the diversity of experience.
Right, which can feel overwhelming for a lot of people, and understandably so, because the follow along question becomes, okay, what are all the other ways?
Right.
Right.
Or why,
Or
right? Like maybe
why?
you can
Or then
explain
who
the
am I?
science. Right.
Right. I mean, this is an interesting question in and of itself. But for me personally, what really grabbed me about this question was it connected me to a memory that is very much in the forefront of my mind all the time when I think about practice. When I was in practice, there were maybe a dozen or so cases that had such a profound impact on me. I carry them with me in the front of my mind. And one of those interactions was with a mom. And this is, going on probably close to 25 years ago, was with a mom who used an egg donor. And that mom came in, and the very first visit with me insisted that I write on the top of, there's this piece of paper when we used to actually write in charts and there was paper. There's a piece of paper called the problem list. It's now in the front of your medical record electronically. It's a terrible name for what it is, which is the list of problems that you're managing and are they resolved or not. And she insisted that I write on the top of the problem list, do not disclose egg donor status. And I was very young. I was a green pediatrician. And of course, I write it down dutifully. And I don't think about getting into conversation with her about why she's making that choice to shut down the conversation. And I just write it down and I move on. And then flash forward, this child then was managing some issues. And as I was in conversation with the mom, and now the kid is older, the mom was stuck between a rock and a hard place because she was so committed to a narrative of not disclosing because she had not disclosed. And she felt like it was too late at that point. And I felt like I had made a gross error in not engaging her in conversation to ask her sort of why and what was she thinking. Not that I knew what the right thing was for her, but just to start the conversation and start the thinking. And now here she was these years later. And the question she had when she was circling back had to do with, is this genetic? Does this have to do with the egg donor's genes? Is this psychological? Does it have to do with my lack of disclosure? I mean, it was all these questions that honestly, Vanessa, had very little to do with the problem at hand, but clearly she was struggling with her own personal choice of non-disclosure. And it made such a big impact on me that when this question came up, that was the lens through which I saw it, it was all the conversations you just mentioned, plus this idea of lying by omission.
Right. And I want to ask you in a second what guidance you get in medical school about
None.
this topic. None.
I mean, maybe today they get some, but back in the 90s, we did not. This was not a hot topic of conversation.
Because it's interesting when we used to run Dynamo Girl puberty workshops, and they were with really 8 to 11-year-old girls. We would talk about ovulation. We would talk about menstruation. We would spend a little bit of time on fertilization, that if a person chooses, they can make a baby, and that baby would grow in the uterus.
And sometimes, I mean, we have to be complete here. Sometimes it's not when they choose, and it happens spontaneously unknown to them. They have
Right,
unprotected
except we don't
sex.
have that conversation with 8 to 11-year-olds.
Correct.
Yes.
Yes, you did
So
not in your workshops, but I
No.
just want to say for the framing of this
Yes,
conversation.
for the framing. But with the kids, it was, we made it clear you never have to have a baby. And also, here's one way people can have babies. And you had to see the number of hands go up, Cara, because all of a sudden these kids were joyfully and openly sharing the ways that they were made, right? And this one, oh, I was actually born by a surrogate, and this is what
It's
my parents told me
amazing.
about it. And oh, I was actually born my mom's egg, but with a sperm donor. And there was no shame. There was no judgment. There was curiosity and openness. And these were, 8-year-old, 9-year-old girls, and they were sort of joyfully sharing their own stories that had been told to them in really beautiful ways. And so
this was her question: is how do I get there?
yes.
Like literally, that was the question.
You mean besides
that we
us
were being
running in-person puberty workshops?
Yes, exactly. I mean, this was, and to think that someone who is trained to bring babies into the world was asking how to have a conversation with the baby that they brought into the world
Mhm.
about how that baby was brought into the world. I mean, it's like so meta, right?
So I
It's very
think
meta.
what I'd love to do is go through really step by step how we talk about creating a baby, the science of it, and sort of as kids get older, what they're capable of understanding. But before we do that, I think it's really valuable to just offer up some overarching principles about how to have any of these conversations, because yes, this could be about making a baby, but it could also be about the different ways people have sex, or the different relationships people choose to be in, or any number of the millions of different topics that we are obligated to teach kids about. So, my favorite thing that we talk about all the time is not to forget how much kids appreciate the science, that they feel excited, empowered, respected when we really explain the science. And I don't mean like pulling out a med school textbook, but they love it. I mean, like one of my kids had the Human Body Theater book from National Geographic, and it has like all the different anatomical drawings, and he loved it. He spent
That
hours.
is a medical textbook. I mean, I'm not joking. Like anything that skews anatomical, Vanessa, is amazing. And
So
they love it. You are
they
right.
They love it. So don't assume, right? We dismiss kids in so many ways. Don't assume they're not interested in the science, because they really enjoy it. It sparks their curiosity. It helps them feel respected and involved. So that's one that I really like to lean into. Cara, what are some of yours?
I have two. The first is don't assume that they want to keep this fabulous news to themselves. Like, you've just told them something mind blowing, and they must get on the bus tomorrow and share the news with everyone, right?
Right. So privacy is a big thing. Like you have to know. And when we talk about, let's say, conversations with kids about porn, we'll say, hey, this is like for our family. And every family is going to choose to talk about these topics differently. It's not your obligation or your responsibility to share it. However, this is about how they were made. This is
That's
not about
right.
some abstract, separate, complex, fraught topic. This is about them. And so one of the push and pull is like it's about the parent and how they made this kid, but it's also about the kid and what their origin story is.
And I think one really helpful way into that conversation is to say to the child in your life, I'm really fill in the blank, excited, nervous, whatever your adjective is or adjectives are, to share this information with you. Other parents feel the same way about sharing this information with their kids. So this is our conversation to have. but it's not yours to have with a bunch of other people at this age and at this time. And as you get older, this may be something that starts coming up more naturally. But right now, this is a conversation we're having between us, and your friends may or may not have had these types of conversations with their parents. And that's appropriate. And I think that's really helpful. The other big picture framing that I would offer up is what you said at the top, which is there is a difference between how families are made and how babies are made. And frankly, it has taken us as a country a very long time to understand and talk about those differences in a meaningful way. And so it's not going to be a one-time conversation with your kid. These are big concepts to wrap their brain around. They know family structures that they have seen growing up, that they know their friends' family structures from going over to their friends' houses. They know relatives' family structures, but their worldview, as broad as it is, given that they can get anything they want on the internet, it is also very narrow. And so one way into this conversation is to help start by dividing those two topics. The definition of a family is this, a definition of how a baby is made is this. And those two conversations are really 200 conversations, right? They're
Yeah.
very
And I
low
mean,
and
I'll
long.
give you an example of the times when those things overlap or intersect. So I have a bunch of friends who are what we have always called single mothers by choice. They chose to have children on their own, and they use sperm donors, and they're raising, incredible, delicious, delightful children who my kids love spending time with. But inevitably, there are questions. And I remember, questions about, is there a partner? If there isn't a partner, how was the baby made? And one of my kids was younger, and we saw a friend of mine and her baby. And my friend made it clear that she was a single mom. And my son, said to her, "Hey, I hope it's not rude if I ask, but like, how did you make her?" And my friend said, "No, it's not rude at all. I'm so happy to answer that question." And they had a whole conversation about sperm donors. Now, he was 12 at the time. So, this was a kid who had developmentally was able to kind of have that conversation. But the thing that I always held on to was he was very curious and
Mm.
also very wary of being offensive or
Right,
asking a
respectful.
question. He
I would call
wanted to
that
be
respectful.
respectful, but he
Yeah.
also really wanted to know. And so making space for kids to sort of say and ask things that sort of tiptoe up to the line of privacy or things people might not want to share, and making room for that while also letting them know, hey, you can be curious. Some people may answer, some people may not. And sort of figuring that out is a complicated part of it.
So, Vanessa, when you and I talk to people about how we teach, you always use an analogy that is the perfect analogy, which is why you always use it. And you use your hands while describing it. So I'm
Do
going to
I?
do that. Hey, YouTube watchers, you get to see my hands. You describe the spiraling information. Those of you who can see that I'm a DJ spinning the record. You describe the
DJ Jazzy
spiraling
Cara.
DJ Jazzy Cara. Goals. You describe the spiraling nature of these conversations. So I'd like to get to the heart of this question by walking people through how we spiral through answers to questions like this. We're going to use this one as our example, but you're going to be able to see how you can apply it to other topics that are related, right? So what do we mean by spiral? What we mean is there's a first pass answer, which tends to be very general. And once you can establish that baseline of information, Then there's a second pass conversation that gets more specific, and then a third pass and a fourth pass. And over time, these conversations move in slightly different directions. They might circle back to the general foundational stuff, and then they might go down another rabbit hole. This is a strategy I still use with my kids as they are in college. I mean, gut health is something we talk about a lot in our house. How are you eating now that you don't live at home?
Do you really want to know the answer to that question?
Well, it's all related to, there's a lot of conversations about bathroom habits in my house.
Yes.
It's very, very like on the family chat. There's lots of conversation, and it's
Do you
not
get
done.
photographs? Sometimes I get
No.
photographs. I
Well,
feel
okay.
really blessed. Hashtag
Yeah,
blessed.
And you say your kids don't want medical information. My kids, it's really that they have come to recognize that aside from potty humor, like the understanding what your bowel movements look like and how that relates to your health is really important. And they have lots of questions about it, and they're really open about it. And we will constantly circle back to some of the foundational issues, like how do you like what basics do you have to remember before we spiral down to the corner of, yeah, I ate this little thing and now my stomach hurts, and is the thing that I ate causing this, right? I mean, like, that's the granular piece. And it's not a great analogy, but when it comes to how babies are made, the foundational piece is an egg and a sperm, right? I mean, I think we need to have a very simple explainer of how humans reproduce. And at its most foundational level, you have the genetic material from an egg and the genetic material from a sperm combining. And that is not a values-based statement. And it is not a judgmental statement. And it doesn't say how people should love each other. It's just basic foundational fact that is where a fetus is created, which grows into a baby, which grows into an infant, which grows into the school age kid or the tween or the teen or the young adult that you're listening on behalf of right now. Right. And so reminding kids of that foundational fact is an important starting point.
And not assuming that because they've had health in school or their biology teacher, kids need to hear stuff several times and often from several different sources in order to internalize it, particularly when it's like a big topic, like how are babies made? And what's interesting is people ask us all the time, when is the first time I should talk about sex with a kid? Meaning sexual intercourse. And what we have seen over the years and working with kids is for many, many years, the question is actually, how are babies made? And then at a certain point, the question shifts to, what is sex? And people would probably argue the question of what is sex is coming earlier and earlier because of kids' exposure on, tech and social media. But the question doesn't start out, what is sex? The question is really about, how are babies made? They may have younger siblings. They may have a teacher who's pregnant. They may have a friend who has a new addition to the family, right? They want to understand that. They may have pets who are puppies and they're waiting for that puppy to be born, right? There's a million ways. And so for people who are really stressed about the sex conversation, it's actually important to go back to Kara's initial framing, which is an egg and a sperm meet and get fertilized and grow into a fetus. And you actually don't have to have a sex conversation at that initial point.
Right. And we're not saying you don't have to ever have a sex conversation, but they actually, this is a really foundational piece of information. They also start asking really interesting questions.
Really interesting questions.
Really interesting. I mean, this is a generation of kids who science fiction and real life are colliding. And so they ask questions about how genetic material can be mashed up in a different way, right? Do you really need an egg and a sperm? Will you always really
Mhm.
need an egg and a sperm? Super interesting. They also go to the end stage of pregnancy. I found, Vanessa, that the most common path when I would teach sex ed in the classroom, that first foundational lesson, because the sort of egg and the sperm coming together was either boring, they had all heard it before, or for some, a little too much or a little too granular. They all wanted to go to the end point. How did I get out? And that was the story that, it could be 2 hours of fourth graders raising their hand. Well, I was born by C-section. Oh, well,
Mhm.
I was born by natural delivery. I was a home birth. I was a water birth, and it's like they all know their landing story. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. So that in your spiral, the first pass is egg sperm. The second pass, which could come a day, a week, a month, a year later, right? Is what? Like, where do you go next, Vanessa?
Right. So next, you go to the fertilized egg growing. And at a certain point, you're going to have to talk about how that fertilized egg got into the womb, got into the uterus. Was it because it was vaginal intercourse and it just sort of naturally got there? Was science involved to implant it? And when we talk to kids about sex, we talk about the different ways people have sex, right? And one way people have sex is a person puts a penis inside another person's vagina, and we talk about, hopefully it's fun and it feels good, and they should have permission, and maybe they talk or they laugh, and the penis can ejaculate inside the vagina, at which point the kids are like, thank you very much. I'm leaving the house and I'm not sure I'm coming back, right? Because they're like, holy cow, penis, vagina, like they're just like, oh my God, this is so much. And
Words.
words that are making me uncomfortable coming out of my parents' mouth. And then I'm imagining them doing that, which is like a whole other layer. And, that's a whole thing. So, but then for lots of families, that's not how the kid is made. And I just want to acknowledge for lots of families, when science is involved in making a baby, there has been a whole personal narrative before the moment that the child you are talking to, explaining how they were made. There can be agonizing experiences of miscarriages and inability to conceive and emotional trauma and a million life experiences that we can only begin to imagine. And so it's
And they're
not
not always tragic.
and they're not always tragic, but
totally.
they're hard and they're expensive and they're grueling and all of that stuff. And so I just want to finish this point. A parent has to decide, there's the science, and the parent or the person explaining the situation has to decide, how far back in the story do you choose to share the choice about using science to make a baby?
I think that's right. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the single parents by choice that you talked about earlier. There are a lot of people who for them, their story is all joy, and this is how they want to build their family. There are other parents who there is not an egg and a sperm in the equation. There might be only sperm. There might be only eggs, right? Depending upon the sex of the parents. And so that also layers in, and it's the opposite. All of this is the opposite of tragic, because all of this is a group of parents who can generally say to their kids, I wanted you here so badly that these are the choices that I made. But when do you tell them that? How do you tell them that? And when they are asking about their origin story, we always talk about leaving your baggage at the door. Like,
Right.
their origin story is not necessarily about your journey there, although your journey there has everything to do with it.
Right. And so people have to figure out if the child talking to you is a child who came after a stillbirth.
That's right.
And your family acknowledges that baby that was born as a stillbirth as a child in your family, and they are named, and they're, there's that as part of your narrative. As you said, Cara, it doesn't always have to be tragic, although it's, a stillbirth is terribly, terribly difficult. We've had that experience in my family, and it never leaves you. I should say I did not have a stillbirth, but I have a family member who experienced that. And yet that family member went on to have several more beautiful, healthy children. But that baby that was born as a stillbirth is a huge part of their family and their family narrative. And then,
That's right.
then we talk about adoption.
That's right.
And how do we include that in the narrative? And there's I'd love to do an episode specifically on adoption, because there's so much great research and guidance for families on when and how to talk about that. I have 2 cousins who were adopted, and they were told very, very early on and knew, from a very young age. And what's beautiful is they come from 2 different sides of my family. And the older one, who was adopted, has mentored my younger cousin who was adopted, and they have this really beautiful connection and shared story there. So yes, it doesn't have to be tragic.
Right. And we will do adoption. I come from a family where 2 of my brothers were adopted at birth, and see how the spiral.
Yes.
It's not even, it's, a spinning top where the spiral keeps going,
Blurs.
but it doesn't get more focused on the center. It just keeps circling and circling and circling. And that's what sometimes these conversations feel like. And that's appropriate. It can feel like it's going nowhere because there are so many directions for it to go in. And yet, every one of these conversations that cobbles together over years helps a kid build a very, very robust foundation for how they can think about family and the construction of family, and how they are going to, if they choose to have children, tell their children about their origin story. And you're just planting these seeds at the core of the question of how do you explain to a child where they are from in the "Where Do I Come From" book sense of the word. And you're trying to do it because maybe there was an egg donor, maybe there was a sperm donor, maybe there was both, maybe they were adopted, maybe all the things. Maybe they were IVF, in which case maybe it's the parents' sperm and egg, but a different body carried it, if there was a surrogate carrier versus if the mom, there's so many scenarios. But at the core of it comes a question that we get all the time, which is, how do I, and do I need to, 2 separate questions, tell my child their genetic history? In other words, like, if they're genetically related 100% to the 2 parents in the home, does that matter in terms of health history and explaining things to doctors and being able to predict what they're at risk for later in life, et cetera, et cetera? And if they are not genetically related to both of the parents who are raising them, how important is it for them to know that? And do they need to do anything specific to dig into their health history more? And I just want to say that on that second topic, there is no right answer about, do they need to do any investigative research? And I think that answer is actually really fraught. It's really confusing because on the one hand, my 2 older brothers are adopted, and their entire lives, when they have been asked their health history, it was very important for them to be able to say up front, I'm adopted and I don't know my family history. And until they had that language and that knowledge, they didn't know to say that. They got that language and knowledge very young, but there's a very strong argument. It also made them feel very flat-footed. They still to this day sort of feel like there's a black box of information that they don't have access to. And I do, because I'm genetically related to my parents, and I just know more because I know their health histories. And I think that's very, very frustrating to them. But they have asked me over time what the importance of knowing their genetics is. And I will say, and I'm going to say this, we're recording at the end of March in 2025. And just in the last several days, the company 23andMe has essentially gone under. And there's a lot of talk in the press about people who did 23andMe and have given their genetic samples to a database that is now essentially up for sale. And the question becomes, how protected is your information, and does that matter? And, we can do a whole episode on this, but I actually think it does matter. I think as much as it would be wonderful to be able to fill in that black box, I also think there is a lot to consider before handing your DNA to the public sphere. And in the simplest terms, I think, if an insurance company swoops in and buys all the data that is stored in, whether it's 23andMe or any one of the other companies that does this, then they have access to genetic information about you that may change the way that they choose to cover you. And these are really, these are big ethical questions. These are big, big brain questions. But I guess the reason I bring it up is there is a trade-off between knowledge about what might happen to you based upon known genetics and knowledge that is in the wider universe about you. I will also add, though, you can have you could have never spit in a cup. No one knows your DNA. Your parents' health histories, and still there's plenty of paperwork out there that can be mined with your information. So it's not like any of us are safe from this, but I think it adds an extra dimension for families that are grappling with this and with the importance of, do they try to figure things out or not? It adds a layer of complication.
Can you explain if someone uses a sperm donor or an egg donor, what information they can get about the donor so that it can inform, what they understand about the child that's later produced?
It really varies. And I think it varies based upon where you get your egg or your sperm from and what information they choose to disclose when. I mean, if you used a sperm donor in the 90s, the information that was available then is totally different than today. I had an incredible conversation with a friend of mine recently who used a sperm donor, and her daughter, who is a teenager now, it took her daughter about 5 minutes of searching when she was ready to try to figure this out, and found her half sibling. And the mom was caught totally off guard, had no idea the daughter was curious about it, right? They've had open conversations forever. The mom was caught totally off guard, but mostly because this was something I learned. I don't know if you know this, Vanessa. In some sperm banks, you can opt to buy the entire supply of sperm, so that in theory, if you choose to use that sperm for future offspring, you can, but otherwise there are going to be no half siblings. Of course, this mom, having done that, was operating on the assumption there would never be any half siblings. What's to stop someone from going to a different sperm bank and donating sperm there? And that is precisely what happened. And so this kid has half siblings, which is just fascinating.
And I know people who have built sort of extended families with their children and their children's half siblings who had the same sperm donor, and they have gatherings and they get together, and the kids have built relationships. And, um, to your point earlier, everybody's going to choose to do it differently. And some people may keep it more private, and other people may build community through it.
Right.
All right. So we don't know. It really varies on what information we can have about a sperm donor, an egg donor. And in terms of adoption, again, does that vary widely as well?
It varies. And adoption doesn't just vary in terms of sort of the path to adoption, but also there have been waves over time of international adoption hotspots, right? Where there have been areas in the world where there's been a high adoption need. And like there's this wave of kids who get adopted into families in other countries when the need is identified. And, what information they do or don't get and how much is reliable and all that is very variable. I would say the thing that egg donor, sperm donor, and adoptive kids all share is that even if they have a ton of information in the moment, like when that child is first born, let's say you have a robust family history, then the clock stops. And from that point on, you generally don't continue to gather medical history. So if you think about adults of reproductive age, if you've got someone who is in their, 20s, 30s, 40s, who is engaging in egg donation, sperm donation, or putting a baby up for adoption, there's a high likelihood that their health history really hasn't been written yet.
Mm-hmm.
They're young. They haven't had the cardiovascular events. They haven't been diagnosed with their autoimmune disease. So even if they fully disclose, you actually don't know what's coming. And that's where the question of genetic testing always comes in. It's like it's more predictive of the future. And they understand the desire to fill in that hole. But having your data out in the public sphere is a big issue. And also, genetics aren't 100% determinative of what happens to a person. It's how their genetics interact with the environment, right? Something we talk about on this podcast all the time. So if you're a smoker, you're much more likely to develop heart disease. You might have a genetic predisposition towards heart disease, but if you never smoke, you may never develop it. So understanding risk and relative risk and the expression of risk and all that. It's like, talk about spiral, Vanessa. It's a lot.
Yeah. And it gets at the question of puberty, because kids really want to know, when am I going to hit puberty? And when am I going to get my period? How tall am I going to be? And that has genetics play a big role, not an entirely, it's not all destiny, but there is a big role in terms of genetics. And it's hard if you have an egg donor or a sperm donor or a kid is adopted and you don't have an answer to that, because we're already lacking in answers for a kid going through puberty and, developing and growing and changing. And there's so much unpredictability, and there's so much we have to say, I don't know to. And this is yet another thing that we have to say, I don't know. And figuring out ways to say that in a way that is compassionate.
Mm-hmm.
And even maybe voicing your own frustration. Hey, kiddo, I wish I could tell you. I wish I had more information for you. I don't, but I will do the very best I can to, be in touch with your doctor and understand what's going on and answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. But this is one where I don't know.
And I'll spin it a little idealistically, but I think another way to have that conversation, depending upon you and your temperament and your kid and their temperament is to celebrate the fact that really no one knows. And even if you are growing up in a house where you are 100% genetically related to the people who are raising you, you still don't know exactly what
Right.
your path is. And there's something kind of incredible about having no expectations, which does not mean low expectations. It's like the future can be anything. And I think it's a really idealistic way of looking at it. And it's hard for kids who, as you often say, Vanessa, wake up in a different body every single day. Like, come on, give me a break. They want to tether to something. But how often do parents who are genetically related to their kids look at their kids and go, where did they get that
Right.
from?
Right.
And so there's almost this incredible permission to not be wedded to some path through because you don't know the path through. And for some families, that version of the narrative is going to work. And for a lot of families, it's not.
So, can we close with just a little bit of scripting for people who are feeling empowered and emboldened to go out and have some of these conversations that maybe they've been putting off? Let's say we've got a kid who was made via IVF. What's some language that you would offer up for people to use?
Yeah. And let me start by a request for books that you all know of that you have loved that cover any one of these topics. Send them our way. We're always interested. There's always something somewhere out there that we haven't found. So we would love to hear more from you. So for kids that were conceived scientifically, so using science, personally, I think that's a great way into the conversation. And it sounds something like this. Once you've had that very foundational, in order to make a baby, it takes an egg and a sperm. That's one conversation. That's not part of this conversation. Once that's that, a follow along conversation at some point is there are lots of ways that an egg and a sperm can be brought together. And sometimes it happens inside the body. And sometimes science helps. Like you can actually, there are science laboratories that are able to take a sperm and an egg and bring them together. And that's called fertilization. And then that fertilized egg gets implanted in the womb, the uterus. And you show a picture of the uterus or you talk about what the uterus is the womb. It becomes the home where that fertilized egg can develop and grow. And it's so amazingly cool.
And that, may lead to some questions that you may or may not be ready to answer about, well, why was I made that way? Or how did you decide?
Was I made that way?
Yeah.
Right?
Was I, or did you decide? How did you decide?
Yeah.
And you may get questions that feel really comfortable for you to answer, and you can answer them as best you can on the spot. You may get questions that you don't feel ready to answer or that feel hard, or there may be baggage that you haven't yet left at the door. And so you also have the right to say, that is such a good question. I'm so glad you asked me that. I'm going to circle back with you on that. And maybe you then call, your partner or your best friend or your therapist and you say, hey, my kid is asking me this question. I realized I got really emotional. Can you help me out and help me kind of unpack this a bit? But then you got to make sure to circle back. If you tell a kid you're going to circle back, you got to build trust and circle back. So not everything has to be laid out in full that very minute. You don't have to back up the dump truck and unload everything on your kid because, again, they're not going to be able to manage all that information. And if it seems like they don't care or they're not interested or they don't have any follow-up questions, some kids need more time to process, and they may come back tomorrow or a week later or a month later and ask follow-up questions. So don't feel disappointed in yourself. Don't feel disappointed in your kid that it didn't go the way you wanted it to go, because again, this is a long, long journey, and they may come back at some other point, or you may decide, okay, it's time to give them more information. The spiral continues.
Vanessa, that was great. Thank you for having that conversation with me. I feel
It's
so much
super
better.
interesting. And by the way, there's tons of stuff I'm sure we didn't even cover because this is the beginning of the spiral.
So tell us your follow-along questions.
Yes,
Ask us.
send us questions. And we have another episode actually coming out with Jamie Notman, who's a fertility specialist, about the things we want to teach teens about fertility and understanding fertility. So it's a nice episode to listen to in companion with this one.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks, Cara. Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.